Welcome everyone to the launch of Global Prison Trends 2022. I'm Sabrina Matani, a human rights lawyer, and I've had the privilege of working with and for incarcerated women and girls for the past 15 years in a number of organizations. And I'm the co-founder of Women Beyond Walls, a movement building platform which amplifies voices to end the over-incarceration of women worldwide. And I'm joining you from Zambia today. It's an honor for me to moderate today's event. Global Prison Trends is an invaluable resource, and I have often referred to it in my research and advocacy. Thank you to TIJ and PRI for all the hard work that goes into this report and for shining a spotlight on these neglected issues. We have several distinguished speakers today, and I have the pleasure of introducing them later on. I'll briefly outline the format for the launch event today. We'll begin with some opening remarks from the President of the African Court on Human and People's Rights, followed by an overview of the report by PRI, and then have a statement by the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation. We will then have a discussion on some of the themes in the report with an expert panel, followed by a Q&A. Welcome to all of you who are attending today from across the world, and thank you for taking the time to be part of our event. It will be interactive, and we look forward to your participation. Let me add some quick housekeeping notes. There is interpretation offered, so please make sure to select the channel which is your preferred language. The event will be recorded and will be available on PRI's website. The chat box is open and you're invited to introduce yourself and say where you are joining from. And we will share the link to the Global Prison Trends report in the chat box. We'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for a Q&A after we hear from our speakers. So do put any questions for the panelists in the Q&A box as we go along. And please use the hashtag Global Prison Trends if you're posting on social media, and help us get more attention and action on the important issues highlighted in the report. It's an honor to have the Honorable Justice Amani Dawood Aboud, President of the African Court on Human and People's Rights, to deliver the opening address. Justice Aboud is Judge of the High Court of Tanzania and was elected to the African Court on Human and People's Rights in 2018. She has held numerous key positions at national and regional level, and in her New Year message as President of the African Court this year, set out a clear focus on pursuing quality justice across the continent, and acknowledged the central role of civil society as active participants in reform processes. Welcome, Justice Aboud, and the floor is yours.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Justice Aboud. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Well, here in Arusha, it's afternoon. Good afternoon. If in your country it's still morning, good morning. Representative and leaders of the Penal Reform International, distinguished guests, I bring you greetings from the seat of the African Court on Human and People's Rights in Arusha, Tanzania. Allow me to recognize all guests and participants in attendance of this important event. I also, on behalf of the African Court and my personal behalf, extend appreciation to the executive officers of Penal International Reforms for holding this important event, and indeed associating the court as the premier judicial institution of the African Union, with a role to uphold the values of human rights and fundamental freedoms across Africa. As many of you may be aware, the African Court has been in operation for the past 15 years, and despite its challenges, just like every other such institution, the court has made significant achievement in the protection of human rights in Africa. The court has indeed contributed to delivering justice for Africans on the wide range of issues that are address the main current human rights concerns of all regions of the continent. These include classical issues of human rights, such as freedom of expression, women's rights, and political participation, but also, of course, fair trial rights. With respect to fair trial rights, to which today's event is mainly connected, it is worth recalling that the bulk of applicants and rights holders in fair trial cases determined by the African Court are inmates. The court has the opportunity to deal with issues involving the situation of persons in detention, the reason for their detention, the consequences of their detention, not only on them as individual litigants, but also on the national justice system as a whole, and by implication on the situation of persons in detentions across the continent. Distinguished members of the audience, you will therefore rightly consider why the African Court and myself feel particularly honored to be opening today's event, at which Penal Reform International's annual report, published with the Thailand Institute of Justice, Global Prison Trends, is to be launched. Today, as we meet, there are at least 11.5 million people in prison in all corners of the globe. Many comes from the most vulnerable segments of our societies. Many face prison conditions that fall well below the standard of being humane, let alone rehabilitative. We must show them that their human rights matter, their health, their mental well-being, and their lives matter. Prisons overcrowding affects the implementation of regional and international standards, including the UN Nelson Mandela rules, with over half of the world's nations holding more people in their prisons than capacity allowed for. Data and information are an important part of realizing rights for people in conflict with the law. That's why the Global Prison Trends report is valuable in that it provides us with a detailed view of the state of prisons around the world. We need data to track our progress, not only towards the sustainability development goals, but also to realize the human rights standards we have committed to. Data is particularly vital in challenging inclusion. Criminal justice systems remain discriminatory, particularly for people from ethnic and racial minorities, people from poor communities, people who are foreign nationals. Women, as a minority of prison population, are vulnerable and face unique issues, including the threat of or real violence, and being stigmatized because of their contact with the criminal justice system. Justice process frequently deny minority and vulnerable people their rights, and when they are detained, they frequently face discrimination in assessing their basic needs. We see today that the global prison population is growing and expanding. Pre-trial detention is one of the reasons for this. While there is a broad consensus that pre-trial detention is overused, erodes access to justice and the rule of law, it continues to be used excessively. One in three prisoners are in pre-trial detention, thus assumed innocent of the crime they are suspected of. In Africa, some countries have over half of their prison population in pre-trial detention. The costs, both human and financial, of this practice are enormous. As I indicated earlier, although there has so far been no case specifically on prison overcrowding before the African Court, The court has determined cases involving detention generally and in which, for instance, justice was unduly delayed in the national justice systems. In such cases, the court has stressed the imperative that liberty and security must be upheld in all circumstances as guaranteed in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. I'd like to refer here in this respect the case of Anudo Ocheng Anudo against the Republic of Tanzania. Non-custodian alternative to imprisonment, both for pre-trial and as a sentence, need to be urgently prioritized. There was some enthusiasm that prison population would be lowered in response to the pandemic from releasing and the use of non-custodian options. But as the Global Prison Trend 2022 report states, unfortunately, more than 2 years on from the start of COVID-19, it is now clear that it did not result in an overall reduction in prison numbers globally. Again, here, as I can be seen in the case of Law Issa Konate against Burkina Faso, the African Court has set a strong stance on discrimination of offenses, decriminalization of offenses involving journalists by restating that detention and prison sentence for certain such offenses is not acceptable in democratic societies as they have the effect of inhibiting debate on public governance. It is unsurprising that extreme sentences, including the death penalty and life imprisonment, are also factors for increasing prison population. It should be noted that mandatory death sentences have been ruled as unfair and a failure in due process in several judgments by the court. We must recognize imprisonment is overused. An example of this can be seen in the context of petty offenses. The report explained that offenses associated with the poverty, such as homelessness, informal trading, vagrancy, population, and overcrowding. In this regard, of course, one would certainly want to recall the above cited cases of Konate against Burkina Faso on such offenses, but also the advisory opinion issued by the African Court in December 2020. The court notably stated that vagrancy-related offenses violate of the human rights to equality, dignity, and freedom from ill treatment. States, therefore, have a positive obligation to reform outdated criminal laws and to end the practice of arbitrary and unlawful arrests for those offenses or these offenses as per their obligation under the African Charter and many other international instruments that have long been applicable within their jurisdictions. It is essential to ensure that even in the context of crisis, whether it be related to the pandemic, of which we still see the impact from, or due to conflict breaking out, prison systems must be based on the rule of law. People deprived of liberty are the most vulnerable in times of crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic saw many unique measures taken to prevent outbreaks in prisons, as they were considered hotbeds for infection. Some positive initiatives that have come from the pandemic have been described in the report. For example, those that involve prison staff and NGOs to provide critical mental health support in prisons. But there have also been many measures that brought additional restrictions, further limitations on people's rights while detained in the context of pandemic. The short-term impacts of many of these measures, from isolation to the banning of visits, are well in the evidence, including in the report. but long-term impacts are still coming to light. The mental health of people in prison are of particular concern. Prison remains a low political priority in many countries. Investment is low, evidenced most clearly by the physical infrastructure and inability to meet basic needs for people who are imprisoned. Water for drinking and sanitation remain a challenge in many countries and regions. The report has detailed some of the key trends in relation to this. Providing enough nutritious food and sufficient health care are major problems commonly faced by prison systems. A lack of funds and corruption contributes to this. Distinguished panelists, colleagues, and friends, I conclude by reiterating that the 2022 edition of Global Prison Trends is a very much welcome analysis with important findings that should prompt action towards more human rights-based criminal justice system. I thank Penal Reform International and the Thailand Institute of Justice for inviting me to open this important event. And I also congratulate them on this respected publication that each year provides us with data and analysis that is necessary for evidence-based reform towards justice system that leaves no one behind. It is the hope of the African Court that such initiatives be renewed as they contribute to documenting the state of human rights and therefore provide first-hand information to relevant institutions such as the African Court in discharging their mission. The African Court definitely look forward to similar future ventures and cooperation of more specific aspects relating to its work and how joint projects can be developed in this regard. After saying so, I would say that I wish you all the best in this very important event, and I declare that this event is open now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justice Aboud, for those really insightful opening remarks, and in particular highlighting the need to prioritize non-custodial measures and decriminalize petty offences, and also highlighting the really important role that the African Court is playing in protecting the rights of incarcerated people. So thank you so much. I now have the pleasure of introducing Trina Lenihan, Policy and International Advocacy Manager at Penal Reform International and one of the leading people behind this report. Trina has almost 10 years experience in human rights advocacy, and since 2020 has led PRI's policy program, including the development of the Global Prison Trends report. She will take us through the main trends identified in the report and key messages.
Thanks, Sabrina. I will need to share my screen, but I think I need permission for that, sorry. But in the meantime, yeah, we're so pleased to be publishing the report today. Some of you will, I'm sure, be quite familiar with our Global Prison Trends reports, which we've published since 2015 in partnership with the Thailand Institute of Justice. Each year we cover some of the same key topics, tracking trends over time, but also some new issues that emerge through our research as particularly relevant. So I'll briefly take you through some of the highlights, and I'm able to share now, which is great. Thank you. Can you see this? Yeah. Okay. So to set the context, the latest figures from the World Prison Brief published late last year estimate that more than 11.5 million people are imprisoned globally. This is up from the previous estimate of 11 million, which is quite alarming given that, you know, we really hoped the pandemic would reverse this trend, but we'll come back to that in a minute. There is significant regional variation since 2000. with really dramatic increases of 200% in South America, 43% in Asia, but then in contrast, a decrease in Europe. And I'll go into some of the reasons and drivers of these numbers in a moment. There are still chronic levels of overcrowding. Prisons in 121 countries are operating above their official capacity, including 13 countries over 250%. These are both slightly up from last year, which was 119 and 11. But we've also seen that even where entire prison systems are not overcrowded, individual facilities often are, particularly pretrial facilities. And that was also noted by the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture in their annual report recently, which led them to call for a strict cap on the number of people detained in each facility to guarantee the minimum standard in terms of living space, as well as increased use of alternatives to detention. To respond to this overcrowding, we've found that governments are really essentially trying to build their way out of the problem. Instead of investing in new and improved alternatives to detention, our global scan of open source materials found large-scale investment in new and expanded prisons in many countries. So in 2021 alone, at least 24 countries announced plans for or started the construction of new prisons, creating at least 437,000 more spaces worldwide. Turkey actually makes up more than half of this figure, and Sri Lanka 1/5. But it's important to note as well that this is really only part of the picture. This figure includes whole new facilities. It does not include the refurbishment or expansion of existing facilities. And given the difficulty that I'm sure most of you are familiar with in accessing information about prisons generally, this is really a conservative estimate, and we expect that the actual increase was probably much higher. Overcrowding is cited as the reason for the expansion in capacity in many cases, but it is concerning that some of the plans would actually accommodate far more than the current national prison populations. Sri Lanka, for example, that I mentioned, the plans would accommodate more than 3 times the current national prison population. But in other cases, the expansion is based on expected growth of the prison population. So in England and Wales, a really dramatic increase of 100,000 people in prison is expected by 2026. And the plans here include 18,000 more spaces to accommodate some of that projected growth. We also found a general trend for new prisons to be bigger, or even the biggest yet, and some countries explicitly following an American model of really massive prison complexes. Linked to that, there's also a trend towards more rural locations, largely because of the amount of land involved in that. And the report analyzes some of the pros and cons of that. And it also looks at the increasing interest in engaging private companies and public-private partnerships for building and running new prisons, as well as some of the moves away from that, which are mostly linked to poor conditions and treatment in privately run facilities. So what is driving the growth in prison numbers? We've assessed 5 key drivers in the report. Firstly, punitive drug policies have resulted in around 1 in 5 people in prison worldwide being held for drug offences. That's a total of 2.2 million people. And that's a key driver of the regional increases that I mentioned in Asia and the Americas. But breaking that down, almost a quarter of that number are people in prison for drug use. And that doesn't include people held in civil or administrative detention because of drug use. But on the positive side, 50 jurisdictions in more than 30 countries have removed criminal sanctions for drug possession for personal use. Another driver we've looked at is laws that effectively criminalize poverty and status. In all regions of the world, as we've heard already, the poorest and most marginalized members of society are overrepresented in criminal justice systems for acts associated with poverty and survival, with really very little connection to public safety. Criminalizing acts like loitering, begging, informal trading, and using prison as a response for the inability to pay fines or debts all drive up prison populations and overcrowding, while being totally ineffective responses to the issues at play, and only serving to perpetuate the cycle of poverty. There have been some positive moves to challenge these offences in the past year, though at national level, and some of those are detailed in the report. Thirdly, tough on crime policies are meaning more people are in prison for longer life sentences. In many countries, we've seen an upward trend in the number of life sentences imposed, also in their length, the conditions, and the type of offences that can attract a life sentence. There have been some constitutional appeals in several countries with varying degrees of success, challenging life sentences in places like Colombia, Spain, and Italy, which are analysed in the report. And we've also seen that the COVID-19 pandemic is still affecting prison numbers, especially in pretrial detention facilities, because of the impact mostly on the judicial system. Many countries are still struggling to clear court backlogs, and that's leading to more people in pretrial detention and for longer, sometimes even longer than they would be sentenced to if they were actually convicted. And finally, then underlying all of this is the underuse of alternatives to imprisonment, an incredibly slow growth in the use of non-custodial alternatives globally, despite some promising expansion during the pandemic. A serious indicator of the lack of alternatives is the fact that since 2000, the proportion of pretrial detainees has remained fairly constant at the global level, ranging between 29 and 31% of the global prison population. This shows very little progress globally in achieving target 16.3 of the Sustainable Development Agenda to ensure equal access to justice for all. And that target includes an indicator on the proportion of pretrial detainees. Again, there's considerable regional variation and movement, but overall, Africa and Asia continue to have the highest share of people in pretrial detention globally, reflecting some failures in criminal justice systems, over-reliance on things like monetary bail, and so on. So I'll turn now to some trends and analysis on prison conditions against this backdrop of overcrowding in many places. This year, for the first time, the report includes a dedicated section on water and sanitation in prisons, and that finds that access to clean and safe water in prisons varies significantly between countries and even between facilities within a country. The report identifies a range of issues like poor or total lack of infrastructure affecting access to running water, water being contaminated, people having to make do with a bucket of water for all purposes, 100 people sharing one toilet, and the obvious impact on the ability to prevent or mitigate COVID-19 and other infectious diseases in a context of a real sort of lack of sanitation. So why this is the case generally comes down to a lack of investment. Shortages of water in the community are often felt harder in prisons, particularly in conflict and low-income settings, and where there are serious levels of overcrowding, which can be because of a lack of resources and infrastructure, or prisons generally being a low priority, because even in high-income countries, old prison buildings that haven't received adequate capital investment have also led to irregular access to showers or to drinking water. We've seen people having to buy bottled water themselves, and also poor sanitation facilities that don't meet human rights standards. In terms of the pandemic, data on COVID-19 infections and deaths in prisons was not collected at global level beyond around September last year. But from some data we've looked at, it's clear that in a number of countries, new variants of COVID-19 and also the loosening of restrictions have resulted in quite high levels of new infections among detainees and staff in prisons. As we reported last year, where infection rates were kept low in prisons, that was often through quite strict measures, which involved really prolonged restrictions. And that comes at a huge cost to people's mental and physical well-being. And that has continued into 2021 and beyond. And the restrictions in many countries, coupled with substantial resources being directed to the pandemic response, have also meant that healthcare services for people in prisons have had periods where they've been really limited, in some cases just to emergency services, sometimes for months. We've also seen evidence pointing to the long-lasting negative mental health impacts from the restrictions, and the global mental health crisis that we've reported on for several years now, really exacerbated by the pandemic, is unlikely to be addressed with the current levels of mental health staffing in prisons. We've seen in some places as few as one psychologist or psychiatrist for every 16,000 people in prison, or some states having none at all. So in terms of staffing levels more broadly, the quite common and well-known challenges shared across prison systems worldwide mainly relate to poor working conditions and inadequate levels of remuneration to reflect the demands of the job. Challenges to prison staffing shortages from the pandemic have not only continued over the past year, but even worsened in some places, with highly transmissible variants, leading to high levels of staff absences. Vaccine mandates have also led to staff being unable to work in some places like Australia, parts of the US and Canada. And that's all left fewer staff tasked with more and changing responsibilities like, new infection control measures or filling gaps in healthcare and mental health care support. So that's all led to, quite high levels of stress and fatigue among prison staff, as well as reduced prison regimes, because there are fewer staff available to manage activities or programs, or to implement dynamic security in prisons as well, which leaves staff more exposed to risk of violence. But on the positive side, in response to all of that, some new initiatives have emerged to support staff, some triggered by the pandemic, and many of them provided by NGOs, with things like psychosocial support, meditation and yoga classes, online support for work-related stress, and so on. In many countries, the pandemic has coincided with increasing impacts of climate change and conflicts, and that's combining to create this sort of perfect storm of unprecedented challenges to prison systems globally. Almost a third of the global prison system are in the 12 countries most exposed to natural hazards, which are having a real impact. The report includes some examples of this, like in Madagascar, where cyclones and floodings caused severe damage to a number of prisons. The prisons were also then left cut off from emergency supplies of basics like food and drinking water because roads in the area were also blocked. And again, overcrowding exacerbates all of the dangers in cases of extreme weather. In Chad, 44 people died in a prison in one night because they were all kept in a dangerously overcrowded cell at 46 degrees Celsius. And high temperatures can also have more indirect impacts. Research in Mississippi in the US found that on days with an average temperature of 26 degrees Celsius or more, violence in prisons increased by 20%. But despite all of this, prisons are really rarely accounted for in hazard risk management, mitigation plans, or disaster responses, which puts people in prison at increased risk because it's more likely not only that the initial response to any disasters will be less effective, but it'll also be more likely to have knock-on effects in terms of security, food supply, water contamination, or spread of infection. And that can lead to fear among people in prison and unrest. And it also impacts prison staff who are really on the front line in prisons during a disaster and who need to be properly equipped for that. So finally, the report also finds that over 680,000 people are in prison in fragile and conflict-affected situations, often facing quite inhumane conditions of detention, with prisons not able to provide even basic needs. And there are also high rates of reports of torture and ill treatment, and prisons have become targets in conflicts over the past year, most recently in Ukraine, Somalia, and Afghanistan. So I'll wrap up, but this was a very brief overview of quite a detailed report. It covers a lot more areas that I don't have time to go into today. So you'll see things like security and violence, and issues for specific groups in prison, like young adults and women. We have a spotlight on pregnancy and childbirth in prison, and a few others. So do have a closer look. I hope you find it useful, and we always welcome any feedback. So do feel free to get in touch with us. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Trina, for such a detailed presentation. And I always love PRI's infographics. They're such an excellent resource. Edith has shared a link to the report in the chat, but also the infographics. So do feel free to download them and share them on social media with the hashtag Global Prison Trends. I now have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Pedro Arojo Agudo, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation. He started his mandate in November 2020 with 3 decades of research on economics and water management, having served as an elected member of the Spanish Parliament. As we heard from Trina, many prisons face challenges in ensuring access to clean water and sanitation. The Special Rapporteur has sent a video message to give us more insight into these challenges and the human rights impact on people in prison. Thank you.
Trina, can you quickly make me the host again?
And while we're getting the video ready, please do share any questions you might have in the Q&A box, as we will come to a Q&A session shortly.
Dear friends, first of all, I thank you for the invitation to participate in this event. As is well known, effective access to safe drinking water and sanitation are human rights that must be fulfilled in conditions that guarantee health, hygiene, and human dignity. Ensuring that these human rights are guaranteed for all inmates and detainees in prisons or police facilities is therefore an obligation of all states. The democratic quality of any state has a crucial referent in fulfilling the human rights of those who live in situations of greater marginalization, poverty, or vulnerability. And without a doubt, prisons in any country are spaces of marginalization and vulnerability. Still, they are also spaces managed directly by the states, which makes the direct responsibility of the respective governments in the fulfillment of human rights even more evident. Guaranteeing safe drinking water to inmates and detainees at all times is as vital as assuring that they can breathe healthy air. It is also necessary to secure the conditions of health, privacy, and dignity in the toilets as required by the human right to sanitation. This human right also includes the right to adequate hygiene. The COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically and urgently brought to the table the need for systematic hygiene as a basis for prevention and infection control. In this case, for the benefit of inmates and all prison staff and those who may visit inmates. I would like to draw specific attention to the obligation of all governments and authorities in charge of prisons and detention centers to ensure the hygiene and menstrual health of detained or imprisoned women, guaranteeing them the necessary sanitary, material, and conditions of privacy, safety, and dignity. Dear friends, prisons are intended to be at least an expression of the rule of justice in its harshest phase. But there is no justice without respect and an adequate guarantee of human rights. I will end this brief intervention by recalling the words of my predecessor, Professor Leo Heller, after visiting the Pageant prison in Malaysia, reminding governments of their obligation to comply with the requirements of international humanitarian law and the standard minimum rules of the treatment of prisoners of the United Nations, also known as the Nelson Mandela rules, in honor of a man who personally experienced the breach of human rights in the prisons in which he was held. The Nelson Mandela rules stipulate that safe drinking water must be available and that prisoners should be able to keep their persons clean so that the state is obliged to provide them with the safe water and toiletries necessary for their health and cleanliness. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to the Special Rapporteur for that important message, and in particular for highlighting the particular kind of gendered needs that women may have in prison, and that message of no justice without respect for human rights is a very strong one, and one for us to keep in mind throughout the rest of this session. We'll now come to a discussion segment, and we're delighted to have three experts with us who will delve further into some of the trends mentioned in the report. We are joined by Madhurima Danaku, Head of Prison Reforms Programs at the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, and also Adel Dabwan, Head of Penal Reform International in Yemen, and board member of Together for Human Rights, as well as Marvin Much, prison reform activist and co-founder of the Humane Prison Hospice Project, who spent 41 years in prison in the US for a wrongful conviction. Thank you all so much for being part of this event today. And for those joining us online, and it's great to see so many people from around the world, please do pose any questions for our panelists in the chat, as we'll have time for questions shortly. So I'll perhaps begin with a question to all of the experts. We've heard some of the key messages and global trends identified in the report: rising global prison population, main drivers of the overuse of imprisonment, and expanding global prison capacity. And importantly, how this varies between regions and countries. Do you see these trends reflected in your country or region, and what is the impact? Marvin, perhaps you can start us off. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here today. I'll start off by saying that prison has the same effect no matter where you are in the world. Anytime you cage and chain humans, it has the same effect on the people being chained and the people chaining the humans. So if we can come to some consensus on how to fix the brokenness of one prison, we can fix the brokenness of all prisons. I want to say that as far as trends, from my perspective, I watch the prison system evolve and devolve according to economic trends, social and societal biases, who's running the country at the time. In 1980, 1852, California built its first prison. And over the next 130 years, they built 11 prisons. They had 26,000 people in prison. In 1984, after the Cold War had ended and people were flowing out of the military economy, especially in California, into the civilian sector, they needed to replace that lost military economy. And they started the rhetoric, war on fill in the blanks, drugs, war, violence, gangs, whatever. And they started building prisons. Between 84 and 94, California built 22 more prisons, and they went from 26,000 to 174,000 people in prison, and they seamlessly replaced that lost economy with a correctional economy that survives today, second only to agriculture in California. And as California goes, so does the rest of the United States. There's longer sentences. Of particular concern to me is the aging population, an increasing number of elderly prisoners, 55 or older. We're starting to see increasing numbers due to the 3 strikes laws, truth in sentencing, whatever the label of the day is, to fill these beds. In California, it's $91,000 a year to keep somebody in one of those beds on average. So as prisoners get older, they are viewed as being weaker by the rest of the younger population, and they're preyed upon. And they're viewed as nuisances to the people who run the prisons, and people with dementia and Alzheimer's are punished for their behaviors, put in solitary confinement, having their sentences increased due to their infliction. There's approximately 120,000 people in prison today in California, and that's down from 174,000 because the population's appealed administratively, and it was picked up by our prison office, and we got a class action lawsuit that ended in a 3-judge panel, a federal panel, ordering the Department of Corrections in California to reduce their populations. We have aging prisons, many of which have lead pipes, and the prisoners that live in the prisons have to drink water and bathe in and eat food that's prepared with water that is contaminated by leaching lead pipes that were installed in a prison between the 1800s and the early 1900s. So I was very interested in reading the part of this report that talks about the effects of contaminated water on prisoners. Where was I at? Oh, well, one of the things that our organization focuses on is how prisoners die in prison. They will either die alone in their cell, or if they have a cellmate, that cellmate will go to solitary confinement after the death until the autopsy is performed, which is sometimes weeks. And many times these cellmates have been together for decades, and this person must start his grieving process, if he even knows how to do that, from solitary confinement, which I believe is cruel as well. The other way they die is they are taken to an infirmary hospital room in the prison where they're locked in and they die alone there, or they're taken out to a community hospital where they have 2 highly paid correctional officers armed outside their hospital door, and they're chained to their hospital bed, and they take their last breaths in chains. So we at the Humane Prison Hospice Project have implemented a peer support program that relies on prisoners trained in compassionate end of life as caregivers. We want to facilitate, replicate, and support the prisoner trained palliative caregiver program across the United States. We want to raise awareness about the need for prison hospice, the cost of effective solution available to remediate the growing public health problem and the transformative outcomes of prisoner receiving and giving health care or end-of-life care. So we want to advocate for a policy change in the United States and in the world, including an augmentation of the Mandela Mandate to specifically speak on people in custody of state governments. Anytime a person is in the custody of a government, they're the most helpless that they could ever be. So we must recognize that when we hold humans and we chain them and cage them, we have a responsibility as a sentient society to contribute to some societal well, even as we incapacitate people and cage them. There must be something other than vengeance that we are seeking when we take a human out of the community and put them in a cage. Mass incarceration is a worldwide problem. It is turned into a socioeconomic tool. I mean, while prejudice underlies incarceration, because the marginalized communities around the United States are the feeding grounds for mass incarceration, and they're filled with people of color due to our social and economic biases. But make no mistake, mass incarceration does not care what color you are. It's socioeconomic. It is a profit-driven thing, and we must have a conversation about the commodification of human lives for this system.
Thank you so much, Marvin, for your really insightful comments. And I think we really want to acknowledge as well how important it is to have someone with lived experience of incarceration on this panel. And that's so valuable. And thank you so much. And thank you for the great work that your organization is doing and for highlighting the prison industrial complex. And as the report highlights, 24 countries want to build more prisons. So this is really a serious issue. And if I could turn to Matarima, it'd be great to hear your insights, particularly from the regions that you work in, but also as well, if you could maybe perhaps unpack some of the challenges faced by prison staff. You know, the report mentioned some of the staff shortages during the pandemic, and it would be good to have some more insight on that as well.
Thanks, Sabrina. Well, in terms of the impact, if I look at the global prison trends, they're pretty much similar to what we have experienced in India as well. And in a sense that I think one of the trends that is quite I think it's very far away from what it is in the prison trends. In the global prison trends, the pretrial detention rates are more or less same. But in India, we've experienced there has been like an 8% increase in the number of pretrial detainees over the past 2 years because of the pandemic. And you know, if I look at the impacts on prison, I really don't know where to begin and where to stop, because nearly everything about the prison systems has been impacted by the pandemic. You know, prison populations, as we see, are on an all-time high. Overcrowding continues to be there despite the kind of attention that the pandemic brought to prisons. So even where the countries, and especially India, had released a large number of prisoners, but that was all temporary. So meaning that all of those prisoners are now back in prison, causing again the severe overcrowding and issues of prolonged pretrial detention as well. And not to add, not just prisons, but the case pendencies are also high, given that courts had been closed, hearings were not happening, so regular releases, regular bails, and regular disposal of trials has also not happened. So that's also one major aspect. But if you look at the pandemic, what it also meant was a lot of restrictions in prisons. So that meant that physical inspections and monitoring also did not take place, meaning that the restrictions that were posed on prisoners could often have been much higher and more violative of their rights than ever, because there was literally no oversight over them. And definitely, you know, it was difficult for prisoners because they had no communication lines open to their families, to their lawyers, and you know, they would struggle to even know what was happening around them, and what was happening around in the world outside as well. There was enough, you know, chaos everywhere, and that chaos literally, you know, ended up inside the prison as well. So definitely, that ways there's been a lot there. And I'm just finishing up a report, CHRS report to the Commonwealth Heads of Government, which is looking at pretrial detention in the Commonwealth countries, all the 54 countries. And, the trends are startling. The trends do indicate that, governments really need to prioritize efforts to look inside their prisons and address the emergent needs and concerns that have, the impact of the pandemic. So I think the key right now is to really identify and address, what has been impacted, and then find sustainable solutions. And as you said, I'm also going to talk about staff. We generally, when we talk about prisons, we just talk about prisoners, and certainly that's definitely an area of concern. But even prison staff and prison administrators are under a lot of challenges, and partly because of the severe staff shortage that is there. For instance, India has, for I think the past several years, there's been nearly 30% of vacancies in staff. And what that essentially means is that one, prison staff has a lot more responsibilities thrown upon them than what they can actually effectively manage and handle to do. So you'd find the prison superintendent also working as a legal officer, also working for the welfare, and that to some extent that makes it difficult for prisons to be effectively managed as well. And that as a result, what happens is that you find all these violations are happening all around us. So definitely, and the pandemic has impacted prison staff as well, because they were working throughout the pandemic. When there was a lockdown, people were safely in their homes, protected from the pandemic, but they were out there being, emergency institutions that had to continue functioning. And on the contrary, there was probably a higher number of arrests that happened during the pandemic. Then that would usually happen. At least that's what the trends in India have indicated, that despite the lockdowns, there were more arrests, and primarily because they were probably arrested to prevent them from going out, or just maintaining social distancing, etc. So all these issues meant that the prison staffing has suffered also, and even mentally so. So it's been mentally difficult for them as well, as it has been for prisoners. And there have been in some of the states here in India, there were initiatives taken to provide provide some interactions through telecommunication or video communications. But unfortunately, any such measures are usually either a one-time affair, or they're not really as effective as it could be. And we all know about mental health care facilities across the world, especially in terms of prisons. There is a dearth of medical officers, of mental health professionals, and very few of them actually want to go to a prison and interact with prisoners, or provide the necessary support. So all in all, it's been, I think, really a disturbing picture. Pandemic has really impacted prisons on several levels. And as we are still not yet out of the aftermath of the pandemic, if I may say so, with countries are still, as I saw, we're still having outbreaks, they're still having deaths. And I think it's really difficult just in terms of where to prioritize, what to prioritize. And this will not happen unless it's a concerted effort, and it becomes a priority area for the governments. But unfortunately, whatever happens inside the prison, everyone chooses to turn a blind eye and not really, address what's happening there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Majirima. And that's so important. The pandemic isn't over, and many of these issues, people have moved on from them, but they're still absolutely existing. So thank you for highlighting them. And if I could turn to Adele, the report highlighted that over 600,000 people are in prison in fragile and conflict-affected settings. And so it'd be really useful to hear from you about how you see some of the trends reflected in your countries. And in particular, the special rapporteur highlighted in his video message the challenges of access to clean water and sanitation in prisons. And it'd be great to hear a little bit more from you about how this is exacerbated in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Thank you.
شكرا صابرينا، سعيد بالانضمام إليكم في هذا التدشين. تقريبا الاتجاهات العامة لأوضاع السجون في اليمن مثلها مثل بقية كثير من الدول، ولكن بسبب الحرب والنزاع التي تشهده اليمن منذ من العام 2015 حتى الآن 7 سنوات، ازدادت أوضاع السجون تفاقما إلى الوضع الأسوأ. هناك تدخلات كثيرة كنا نحاول القيام بها وما زلنا ونسعى لتحسينها، ولكن اسمحوا لي بداية أن أتطرق إلى موضوعين أساسيين. الأول ما يتعلق بشحة المياه النظيفة والصرف الصحي، والنقطة الأهم في أسباب اكتظاظ السجون في اليمن. اليمن ومنذ بداية الحرب تعرضت كثير من السجون إلى التدمير بسبب إما كانت تقع في مناطق قريبة من مواقع اشتباكات ميدانية، أو تعرضت بسبب القصف من قبل الطيران والقصف البري. كثير من السجناء هربوا من داخل هذه السجون، والبعض قبل أن تتعرض هذه السجون للضرب أو وصول القتال إلى مناطق قريبة منها تم نقل سجناء إلى سجون أخرى، مما أدى إلى مضاعفة عدد النزلاء في هذه السجون التي تم نقل إليها من سجون مدن أخرى. النقطة أيضا الأهم هو النقص في عدد القضاة والرجال الادعاء العام الذين كانوا ينظرون القضايا. بسبب الحرب انتقل كثير من القضاة إلى أصبحت في مناطق تحت سيطرة جماعة أنصار الله الحوثيين في الشمال، ومناطق تحت سيطرة الشرعية في المحافظات الجنوبية، وبعض هؤلاء القضاة كانوا من هذه المحافظات فتناقلوا وتركوا المناطق التي كانوا يعيشون فيها. أدى هذا إلى خلل كبير وإلى التأخر في البت في قضايا السجناء. نقطة أخرى أيضا بدأت حكاية الإضرابات في مجال القضاء في المحافظات الشمالية، يعني هناك إضراب شامل كان يحصل في المحاكم والنيابات في المحافظات الجنوبية. هذا أدى إلى تأخير البت في كثير من قضايا النزلاء، وبالتالي تزايد عدد النزلاء في السجون والاكتظاظ، مما بعض السجون يصبح عدد النزلاء فيها ضعف السعة التقديرية لها إلى بنسب تتراوح إلى 4 إلى 5 مرات. فإذا كان السجن يسع مثلا إلى 500 شخص، تجد أن النزلاء فيه يصلون إلى 2000 وإلى 3000 شخص. النقطة أيضا التي أثرت على الخدمات في السجون بسبب الاكتظاظ هو أن هناك أسرى نتيجة الحرب القائمة، فيتم وضعهم في مناطق داخل السجون هذه، في صحيح في عنابر مستقلة أو في أجنحة مستقلة عن السجناء اللي عليهم قضايا جنائية، ولكن أيضا الخدمات التي تقدم لهؤلاء السجناء أثرت على بقية النزلاء في السجون اللي هم في قضايا جنائية. في الجانب المياه والصرف الصحي، الوضع احنا الBRI قامت بتقييم لأوضاع السجون في اليمن بالتعاون مع UNDP والUN Women. هناك ضعف كبير بسبب تهالك شبكات الصرف الصحي، ضعف توفير المياه النظيفة بشكل كبير جدا. المباني أساسا مباني السجون أساسا قديمة وتحتاج إلى ترميم وصيانة بشكل كبير. الحرب أدت أيضا إلى ضعف الموازنة التشغيلية والموارد المالية الخاصة بالسجون، مما زاد الوضع سوءا. وضعف الموازنة أيضا أثرت على الخدمات الأخرى في الجانب التعليمي والصحي والمهني والخدمات الدعم النفسي والاجتماعي، وكثير من الخدمات التي ضعفت بسبب أو زادت بشكل كبير من بداية الحرب. بالنسبة للموظفين هناك نقص عدد كبير من موظفي السجون، سواء في الأطباء أو المدرسين أو الأخصائيين الاجتماعيين، فبعض السجون لا يوجد فيها ولا طبيب واحد، خاصة السجون اللي هي مش في مراكز عواصم المدن. وهناك نفور من العمل في السجون خاصة من قبل النساء، فنعاني أيضا في سجون النساء من قلة الكادر النسائي الذي يتعامل مع النساء النزيلات في السجون. البنى التحتية كما قلت بشكل عام كانت ضعيفة من قبل، وزاد الضعف فيها من بداية الحرب. هناك تدخلات كبيرة حصلت من بداية الحرب، بعضها قام بها الBRI بدعم من الحكومة الهولندية، وبعضها قام بها البرنامج الأمم المتحدة للماء UNDP، أو الصليب الأحمر الدولي تدخل في بعض السجون لتحسين شبكات المياه والصرف الصحي، تقريبا في 3 فقط إلى 4 سجون، في حين أنه كثير من السجون الأخرى لا زالت مهملة وتحتاج إلى تدخلات لتحسين أوضاع الصرف الصحي وتوفير المياه النظيفة. الBRI أيضا في اليمن ساعد في تحسين شبكات الصرف الصحي وتحسين البنى الإيوائية، ولكن فقط في سجون النساء، تقريبا في 6 سجون للنساء منذ العام 2016 إلى العام 2020. حاولنا أنه نعمل لها صيانة للبنى التحتية بشكل عام لأماكن النساء بما فيها شبكات المياه والصرف الصحي، ولكنها للنساء فقط كما قلت، وعدد النساء مقارنة بعدد النساء الرجال السجناء قليل جدا في اليمن. التدخلات الأخرى في التي نحاول أو نسعى فيها مع السلطات اليمنية لتخفيض الاكتظاظ هو حاولنا تبني برنامج للعقوبات البديلة ولجان العدالة التصالحية، وهذه لا زالت البادرة مؤخرا العام الماضي وانشئت في بعض المحافظات، ولكن بدأنا المرحلة الأولى فقط مع النساء والأطفال، قضايا التدابير البديلة والعقوبات البديلة، يعني العقوبات البديلة ولجان العدالة التصالحية في قضايا الأطفال بالذات اللي هم دون 18 سنة، وفي قضايا النساء. ولا يزال برنامج حديث، يعني أسسنا حاولت الBRI بالدعم من الاتحاد الأوروبي إلى تبني هذا البرنامج، ووجدنا يعني طورنا اللوائح الخاصة بها ودليل الإجراءات، وحاولنا تطبيقه على محافظتين أو 3 محافظات بشكل مبدئي، وكان هناك عدد من الأطفال المستفيدين والنساء من هذا البرنامج. ولكن إذا ما طبق هذا البرنامج بشكل كبير وتوسع في الفترات القادمة فهو سوف يساعد في كثير من حل كثير من قضايا السجناء، وبالتالي قد يخفف إلى حد ما من مشكلة الاكتظاظ في السجون. نقطة أخيرة، كان هناك تدخلات كبيرة أيضا للBRI في الجانب الصحي وفي الجانب يعني مكافحة الأوبئة، خاصة عندما بدأ مرض الكوليرا في اليمن. وأيضا في الفترة الأخيرة عندما تدخلنا بالوقاية من فيروس كورونا بالجانب الوقائي والعلاجي، وتوفير بعض المعدات الخاصة بالتعقيم وتوفير بعض الأدوية في أكثر من 20 سجن في اليمن، أيضا كانت بالتعاون بين الBRI مع الاتحاد الأوروبي. هذه المبادرة تساعد في تحسين الجوانب الصحية إلى حد ما، ولكنها لا تغطي كافة الاحتياجات الصحية في ظل العدد الكبير الذي يصل تقريبا عدد السجناء في اليمن في مختلف السجون تقريبا بحدود 12 أو 14 ألف نزيل خلال العام الماضي هذا فقط. هذا ما حبيت أتطرق إليه في المداخلة هذه، ومستعد لأي توضيحات أو استفسارات من قبل الأخوة المشاركين. شكرا جزيلا، وأتمنى هذا الحفل أنه يخرج بالنتائج الطيبة التي تساعد في تحسين أوضاع السجون في العالم وفي اليمن خاصة نتيجة الوضع الصعب الذي تعيشه نتيجة الحرب. شكرا.
Thank you so much, Adele, and for the important work you're doing. Working in prisons is very hard, but especially in the context you are working in. So thank you so much. To close this discussion segment, I'd like to ask all the experts to reflect on the way forward. A running thread through all of the trends is the impact of overcrowding, exacerbating or creating many of the challenges facing prisons and the people detained and working in them. We've heard today about expanding prison capacity and how that is not the solution, but what is the solution? So have you seen any promising moves or initiatives recently to reduce the use of imprisonment? And Madhurima, perhaps I'll start with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think to me, it's been nearly 14 years that I've been working on the issue of imprisonment and prison reforms. And the more I have seen, the more I've experienced, I do feel that one of the ways, like everything's linked to overcrowding, and overcrowding is linked to prison populations. And I think the only way to effectively check your prison populations is to, I think, place effective checks on your arrest, on your arbitrary arrest. Because if you look at the numbers, the number of people who are arrested and then the number of people who are actually tried and convicted, there's a huge disparity between both these figures. And that means that a lot of people are arrested unnecessarily or arbitrarily, and they end up going to prison, even if it's there for a day. But you've really burdened the system for that. So I really feel, and I think part of the research that I'm completing, that is the learning for me is, having better legislative and policy frameworks that effectively, safeguard the rights of pretrial detainees from not just in terms of arrest, but also in terms of placing, time limits on investigations, on trials, on the period of detention. These are safeguards which are really important. And instead of looking at a later scenario when a person is in prison and then you're trying, okay, he spent so many years, let us get him out. It really needs to be, why are people going to prison in the first place? If our premise has always been innocent till proven guilty, why are we moving? Why has the system moved away from this? And why is it that an innocent person has to spend even a day in prison? Why are we looking at, oh, you've spent 10 years, you were not incarcerated? So we really have to change that, and thinking, okay, even a day extra in prison as an innocent person is probably a little too much, and that itself constitutes human rights violation. So for me, the way forward really is to place effective checks on pretrial detention and just safeguard your rights at that point.
Thank you so much. And Adele, have you had any promising initiatives from your context that you could share?
مرحبا. كما تطرقت انه المبادرات الايجابيه الحاليه التي نقوم بها في سياق عملنا طبعا بالتنسيق مع السلطات المختصه على السجون ومع وزاره العدل، هو انه حاولنا نسعى للتخفيف من اكتظاظ السجون من خلال التحول الى البرامج الى العقوبات البديله. هو بدايه برنامج لا يزال حديث، ولكن بدأنا فيه في قضايا فقط الأطفال والنساء. هي بادرة طيبة إذا ما تم توسيع هذا العمل في التعامل مع السجناء الآخرين أو السجناء البالغين بشكل كامل، سيؤدي إلى تخفيف كثير من قضية الازدحام في السجون. بعض القضايا حق السجناء الكبير قضايا لا تستدعي بقائه في السجن لفترات طويلة، ولكن التأخر في إجراءات التقاضي وإجراءات التحقيق والمحاكمة هي التي تجعل السجون مكتظة بشكل كبير نتيجة التأخر في البت في القضايا والإضراب الذي تشهده بعض المحافظات من إضراب القضاة عن العمل. حاولنا نحن أن نسعى في وضع دليل حول المحاكمات العادلة للأطفال والنساء والبالغين، وتم تعميمه من قبل وزير العدل وإصدار به قرار بحيث أنه يحاول قدر الإمكان التخفيف من مدة الإيداع ومدة السجن والتعجيل في القضايا. كل هذا تقريبا بدأ من العام الماضي والعام الذي يعني من سنة ونصف. سعينا في البداية إلى تطوير هذه المبادرة ونسعى إلى استمرارها خلال الفترات القادمة. كما أن هناك مبادرات أخرى تساعد في تحسين البنى التحتية والخدمات المياه والصرف الصحي بالذات. تقريبا سيقوم به برنامج UNDP حاليا، برنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي، بالتنسيق مع إدارة السجون في المحافظة اليمنية. إن شاء الله تكون نتائجه طيبة، لأنه البرنامج لا يزال جديد، يعني سيبدأ تقريبا من خلال هذا العام أو خلال الفترة القادمة. إن شاء الله نصل فيه إلى نتائج طيبة لتحسين الأوضاع في الجانب الصحي والخدماتي، وبالذات أيضا في تحسين شبكة المياه والصرف الصحي. شكرا.
Thank you so much. And Marvin, so much of your work is a promising initiative, but perhaps you have other aspects from your work that you'd like to share, or other ideas you've come across. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to point out that the U.S. resources prisons worldwide. The companies, many of them based in the United States, it's a huge industry. Last fiscal year, California, with its 35 prisons, cost to taxpayers $15.8 billion. They're on track to spend $20 billion this year on prisons. And the economic tentacles coming from the prison systems in California reach around the world and into other prisons and communities. So the commodification of human lives drives incentive for these companies and these governments to incarcerate poor people who are helpless and unable to defend themselves. If we are going to stand on some moral high ground and point our fingers at people for the virtues that they do not display in their lives, they should be able to see modeled for them those very virtues. But when they look, what these prisoners see is vengeance, and that's a very pernicious emotion. It's very dangerous to the government and to the people that are being governed. They should see modeled for them redemption and empathy and forgiveness, virtues that they claim separate them from the people that they chain. I agree with the comment that was made earlier that alluded to the fact you cannot fix brokenness until you become proximal to it. The walls around our prisons don't just keep people in, they keep people out. And we need to start asking what we are trying to accomplish with these punishments, and how is that working out for us after in the United States more than 150, nearly 200 years of an experiment that has gone horribly wrong. We did a study on homelessness, and everything is interconnected. In the study that I conducted, we found that more than 80% of the men who were homeless were incarcerated directly before becoming homeless, and more than 50% of the women. The rest was all drugs and mental illness. So if we want to affect homelessness, then we would do something at this end of the incarceration process to mitigate the slashing effects of the darkness of prison. People tend to turn away from brokenness, and they avert their eyes. It's not something that they want to ponder for very long. The Japanese have this very beautiful thing that they do, and they have vessels, bowls and cups that they've broken. They will mend them with epoxy and gold, and there's these gold veins running through this now restored vessel that is now functional again, will hold things. And the breaks are now worth more than the vessel. So there's value in brokenness. We can learn from these people that we're discarding and throwing away. Once you have a chance to speak to them at some intimate level, you're going to find that they're mothers and fathers and sons and daughters and grandmothers and grandfathers. They are people, they're humans. And we must do better with our punishments. I left people there that I love them. And it is not something that we can keep turning away from. This is not something that we need to do for the fallen and broken men and women in prison. This is something we have to do to save ourselves as a society. we cannot continue to keep throwing lives away like this.
Thank you so much, Marvin. And those are really powerful words to sort of end our discussion segment on. And I especially kind of wrote down, you know, value in brokenness. And I certainly from my own work have learned so much by, you know, from the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women that I've worked with. So thank you so much for that. And to all of the experts, thank you. And I think the resounding kind of theme that comes through is that really we need to be investing in social services and support to stop people going into prison in the first place. And that's really where the resources need to be. And I think that's also really reflected in the report as well. So I just want to make sure we have time to answer a few of the great questions that did come through. Thank you so much. I think the first one is for PRI, and it's about methodology and sort of questions about how you went about putting together the report, and particularly any challenges you've had in data collection, particularly around deaths in custody. So someone from PRI, please feel free to answer that.
Thanks, Sabrina. Yeah, I think there have been a couple of questions actually relating to sort of data collection and the difficulties and the challenges in collecting data related to prisons globally. So that is really important. And this is, you know, something that comes up again and again, year after year, not just with these reports, but, you know, for many people working in the sector. And it's a real frustration because, you know, to have evidence-based reforms, you need to know what's happening and you need to be able to point to the impact on people, as well as, you know, the positives of what works, what has had a positive impact and what can we replicate somewhere else. So we do need information and data for all of that. There are two main points, I think. One is around prisons traditionally being very closed settings, and, you know, it just across the board being very difficult to obtain information in some places. That is evolving in some countries, you know, with increased external monitoring and things like that. But in many countries, it is just a total dearth of information. So you have both challenges in what information is actually collected, as well as then what is transparent and what is published and publicly available. And even where information is collected and published, it's often not disaggregated. So again, you don't see the breakdown or maybe how different things are affecting, you know, specific population groups in prisons. So we see that across, you know, most of the areas that we've worked on and most of the research in the report. We get a bit tired of saying this information isn't systematically collected, but from what we can find, this is the situation. And I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with that. But I'll, you know, allow others to come in on that as well from your own work.
Thank you. Do any of the other experts want to kind of chime in on the challenges around data collection, or perhaps, you know, efforts that you've done which you think are a good example for us to follow?
If I may comment, you know, one of the points on data collection, and again, I face this similar problem when I'm looking at the Commonwealth data as well, is I think in the work that all of us do, you know, the more we emphasize on the need for governments to proactively disclose the data, I think that's been a little missing. You know, we've, you know, in our work, we don't really focus so much on the, you know, how to get governments to put out more data, right? So I think there is, you know, there is some, I think there needs to be some effort there, maybe a collective effort as well, when it comes to looking at transparency in data collection, and also putting that out, because in the research that I have done, a lot of countries, they said, oh, you know, our pro bono councils, they reached out to the prison departments and they clearly said, no, we can't share it in the public domain. So, you know, that kind of ideologies have to change. You know, governments have to realize the benefit of data. As Triona said, like, you know, you can't have evidence-based decision making if you don't have data. You know, where are you going? You don't even know what's happening inside your prisons. And even I think in terms of prison data, one of the biggest, I think, gaps remains is, you know, we really don't have data on the number of people in police custody. I'm not sure that, you know, there are, you know, I think there are very few countries that actually even have that data available. And that can actually be a lot. Like, you know, I from my experience, I remember one of my colleagues in Jamaica talking about this, that, you know, majority of people are actually in police custody, and they don't figure into the data. So you always feel, oh, our prisons have only this much, but in reality, there is a lot more people in detention than what is being let on.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you to all of our experts today for such a interesting and useful discussion. I know we could go on for a long time, but sadly an hour and a half has passed really quickly. And so I'd like to invite Dr. Fisette, the Executive Director of the Thailand Institute of Justice, and then Olivia Rope, the Executive Director of Penal Reform International, to give some closing remarks. And thank you again to all of you for your participation.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. Good evening from Bangkok. I'm Pisette Sargent, and I'm the director of the Thailand Institute of Justice. It is, as usual, an honor for me to be able to join you and deliver a short remark at the end of this launch event. First and foremost, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for their insightful presentations and sharing of their valuable experiences. I would also like to thank all of you, the audience, who have taken the time to attend this virtual event. And most importantly, I would like to express immense appreciation to our partner, Penal Reform International, and all the experts involved for putting out such a timely and useful report. The TIJ is a UN Program Network Institute based in Bangkok. Since 2011, we have worked extensively on research, policy advocacy, and capacity building to promote the implementation of the United Nations standards and norms related to crime prevention and criminal justice in Thailand, the ASEAN region, and beyond. It has been our pleasure to work with the PRI to promote a humane and right-based prison system over the past several years. The Global Prison Trend Report published annually by the PRI in collaboration with the TIJ aims to provide a comprehensive resource that explores the trends, challenges, and opportunities in prison policy and practice worldwide, which can be used by stakeholders in and outside the justice system. Since the beginning of the COVID-19, we have seen the continuous rise in the infections and deaths in prison during the pandemic years. Long before the outbreak, most prisons were already struggling with the overcrowding and under-resourcing. In Southeast Asia, where we work, most penal systems are severely overcrowded, primarily due to punitive drug policies. Globally, there are over 2 million people incarcerated for drug-related offenses, contributing to high prison population in several countries. This situation undermines the rehabilitative goal of prison and the well-being of prisoners. This year's report highlights a number of issues that continue to trouble prisons and their occupants, ranging from the criminalization of poverty, the experiences of young adults and pregnant women in prison, and the provision of water and sanitation behind bars. Now, from a human rights perspective, there are certain basic physical requirements that must be met for the state to fulfill its duty of care. These we know include adequate provision of accommodation, clothing, bedding, food, drink, and exercise. And our panelists today touched upon some very diverse and pertinent issues. The issue of access to safe drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene, as mentioned by the UN Special Rapporteur, is not only crucial for a person's health, but also to their well-being, especially during the time of the pandemic. Also, an incarcerated person shall have the right to be treated with respect and humanity and have their dignity respected at all times. They have the right to stay connected with their family and shall have access to health services, including medical and mental health treatment without discrimination. The protection of these basic human rights, however, have been put to the test during the outbreak. Therefore, today's event is a good opportunity for us to revisit what happens in prison globally and its effects on the 11.5 million people incarcerated worldwide. The report provides a great deal of information on key issues faced by the general population, prison population as well as the specific groups of prisoners, including women, children, young adults, and LGBTQ+ people. Recognizing the prisoner as an individual and taking account of their social, economic, and cultural background will be an important step to ensure that their needs are effectively addressed and their rights protected. As we look towards the future, we need to ensure that imprisonment is used as the measure of last resort and non-custodial alternatives are prioritized as a sustainable solution for criminal justice reform. Investing in non-custodial measures not only ensure fair and proportionate criminal justice response to crime, but also help remove the harms of imprisonment felt greatly by vulnerable persons. Moreover, we need to reverse the growth in the number of women, children, and other minorities in prison as part of ongoing efforts to decrease the number of people entering the corrections system, especially for minor offenses and pretrial detention. Finally, THJ believes that efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals cannot succeed without a criminal justice reform that centers the voices of the incarcerated, involving multi-stakeholders in and outside the system, and prioritizing rehabilitation and a humane system that serves all, both now and moving into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fizet, and thank you, Sabrina, for moderating so wonderfully today. I'm particularly proud of our report this year as Executive Director of Penal Reform International, and I want to thank my colleagues and all of the experts who contributed to the report, led by my colleague Trina. And I think overall this conversation today has just really touched on some of the most sobering issues and some of the most deeply troubling statistics. Many of the issues discussed today can serve as indicators, I think, of whether the imposition and also the implementation of prison sentences are effective, are fair, are human rights compliant, and overall are serving their purpose ultimately. These indicators are things like levels of violence, overcrowding rates, pretrial detention rates, and looking at what offences people are in prison for, and so on. I was thinking that whether you take a broad or a very detailed view of data on such indicators, it's really clear that we're not moving in the right direction in improving the realization of human rights for people caught up in conflict with the law. And I might add that these people are often from vulnerable and discriminated against segments of our societies, as we've heard today. So I think we will be able to move in the right direction, and we'll be able to see this when we finally get to report that globally prison systems are downsizing and not upsizing. And our data on the expansion of prison capacities globally is really a grave indicator of what Sabrina mentioned about investment being funneled down the wrong pathway into prisons. Marvin has spoken about this as well. The investment is going into the wrong things. And I just thought maybe it's important to end on a note that we should remember that behind all of this data and statistics and sometimes dry information, there are people behind this, there are lives at stake, there are families, or as Marvin says, these people are humans and we must do better for them. So ultimately, we are all working towards criminal justice systems that do no harm and uphold human rights. And I want to thank everybody for joining this conversation today, which is an important one to have that we convene annually. But we hope that the conversation can continue beyond this event. So thank you all for joining, and we sincerely hope that Global Prison Trends 2022 and the other reports in our series published with our friends at the TIJ is a useful resource for reform that is evidence-based. Thank you all.